Hello, you guys. So, today we will be discussing the novel Jane Eyre, and we will be basically talking about each chapter. So, I'm gonna be summarizing it for you, and I will be, explaining some things and telling you about the symbols and, important quotes, the character traits, the relationships between the characters, and we'll be discussing the phases of Jane's life because Jane Eyre is the heroine of the novel because we go through everything with her. We learn the lessons she's learned. We read about how she's feeling. We just know everything about her, and then we're gonna discuss the family tree because it's very complicated throughout the novel. Like the more you're into the novel, the more complicated it gets and the more things we learn. So now we will be starting with summarization. So we're going to summarize from chapter 1 till 10 in this, video. And later we will be discussing the themes in another video, and I have a PowerPoint presentation. And in another video I have a quiz. I'll be quizzing you on how, you understood the novel and basically simple questions. So you need to watch my series in order to really understand the book. Now we have chapter 1. So in chapter 1, it's a dreary November afternoon at Gateshead. Gateshead is where Jane lives currently. So during this chapter, we are introduced to the main character Jane, who is an orphan. She lives with her cruel aunt, Mrs. Reed, who forbade her from playing with her cousins, Georgiana, Eliza, and the master of the house, which is John. So John's the master because his father passed away. John throws a book at Jane, which aggravates Jane, and a fight happens. The fight results in Jane being sent to the Red Room. The Red Room is where her uncle passed away, and her uncle is Mr. Reed. Chapter 2. So the servants forcefully took Jane to the Red Room, and Jane was screaming and kicking not to go, but they forcefully took her inside. And then Jane saw her reflection, and she was shocked. She began reflecting on how she had gotten herself into the situation she was in. Then she began thinking about Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed's her maternal uncle that passed away, so he's her mother's brother. She wondered on how her life would have been if he was alive. And then she remembered when Mr. Reed was dying, he made Mrs. Reed promise her that she's gonna treat Jane like she treated Lisa, Georgiana, and John. But obviously, Mrs. Reed broke her promise. Then, Jane thinks that Mr. Reed's ghost is in the room and he has come to punish Mrs. Reed for breaking her promise. Jane freaks out and begins screaming in terror. Mrs. Reed tells Jane that she will be staying an additional hour for screaming. Chapter 3. So Jane wakes up in her own bed, unaware of how she got there, so she was unsure of the events that took place. Later, she discusses her mental state and her life at Gateshead with her family apothecary, Mr. Lloyd. He suggests that Jane go to school. Jane was actually looking forward to the possibility of leaving Gateshead. Jane was being, abused. She really had no support system and she wasn't really happy there. So anything was fine. It wasn't really somewhere she was attached to. She wasn't really attached to Gateshead. And then in bed, Jane overhears Miss Abbott, who Jane finds very obnoxious, and Bessie talking about her parents. Bessie was not obnoxious, she was actually kind. Then Jane finds out that her mother's father disapproved of Jane's father. Therefore, he cut Jane's mother off the will. After her parents got married, her father contracted a virus called typhus, which is deadly, and then he gave it to her mother. And so that's how her parents both died. They died from a virus called typhus. Chapter 4. And then in chapter 4, 2 months pass by, so it's January, and Mrs. Reed has been crueler than ever. One day, Mr. Brocklehurst, the head of the school that Jane will be attending, the school is called Lowood, and then that man arrives and he begins asking Jane questions about religion. Then Mrs. Reed tells Mr. Brocklehurst that Jane's a liar and she has a very bad attitude. When Mr. Brocklehurst leaves, Jane was extremely hurt and frustrated by Mrs. Reed's words. So she scolds her aunt. She tells her she's not going to talk to her and that she has no relation to her and that she's glad she has no relationship to her and that she'll never call her auntie again and she's going to tell everyone how Mrs. Reed treated her. Surprisingly, Mrs. Reed remains calm and leaves the room. Jane felt as if she had won. but a part of her felt shameful. Here you can see that Jane is a good person and she can differentiate between what's right and wrong. But this time she was proud that she did defend herself and she did feel like she won because Mrs. Reed did not answer her back. But a part of her knew that disrespecting her elders was disrespectful and that's why she felt shameful. Chapter 5. Excited, Jane gets ready to begin her journey at Lowood. She and Bessie exchange goodbyes, and Jane leaves alone. After a long journey, Jane arrives tired and exhausted. She really needed to sleep. She was too tired to even dream, so that even shows the extent of how tired Jane was. The next day, Jane learns the routine of the girls and meets the teacher. Later, Jane was outside and she saw a girl reading a book. Jane was intrigued, so she began a conversation. During the conversation, Jane learns that Lowood is a charity school where the students are orphans and the tuition is £15 per year. So you can tell by this that Mrs. Reed wanted to get rid of Jane so bad that she didn't even, put her in a good school because as you can tell throughout the novel, that the Reeds are a very rich family. And they did not even care for Jane, so they just put her in this school where it's £15 per year. Chapter 6. So one morning came, Jane and her pupils were overloaded with work. For breakfast they had porridge. Fortunately it wasn't burnt, but Jane wished it was double the amount that she had eaten. So basically, the living conditions in Lowood were not good, and despite being abused at Gateshead, Jane did have it an easy way. Despite being abused and going through all the stuff she went through, she always slept with a full stomach and she had these servants, especially Bessie, who constantly took care of her. But here, it was different, and she really did not have anyone, and she really did have to depend on herself. Life at Lowood was very harsh, and Jane did not have access to the luxuries she had at Gateshead, like I previously said. Later that day, Jane talks to Ellen again, and they begin to become friends. Jane was very impressed with Ellen's knowledge and her ability to handle Miss Catcherd, who treated Helen horribly. So Miss Catcherd is a teacher who was not very nice to Ellen. Then they have a conversation about justice, forgiveness, morals, and Ellen's flaws. So basically, Ellen, she was a very religious girl who had a lot of faith. And Jane, she was religious, but she didn't have that faith that Ellen had. Ellen expresses her disappointment in herself because she constantly daydreams and never focuses when she should be. So Ellen, she has this insecurity about herself because she knows that she could be doing better, but she's not. So that's why Ellen does not feel content with herself. Chapter 7. So Mr. Bucklehurst returns to Lowood. Jane overhears his conversation with Miss Temple. He demanded that Miss Temple decrease the expenses and cut the girl's hair. And then, I did not write this, but Mr. Bucklehurst saw a girl with curly red hair and he demanded her hair be cut. Then Jane gets nervous because she remembers all the things Mrs. Reed told Mr. Bucklehurst about her. And then that makes Jane so nervous that she accidentally drops her slate. So unconsciously, Jane ended up dropping her slate. Mr. Bucklehurst was extremely upset. So consequently, he made Jane stand on the stool. He reprimands her by calling her a liar and demands the student not talk to her for the rest of the day. Luckily, Ellen improves Jane's day by smiling at her and silently showing her support. So you can see here the bond between Jane and Ellen. Like, it just keeps getting better. They were really, really good friends. Chapter 8. By 5 o'clock, Jane was exhausted. She collapsed and she was sure that her reputation at Lowood was ruined. Ellen assures her that her reputation was not ruined and what occurred was more of a positive than a negative thing. Since the girls felt bad for her, Miss Temple takes Jane and Ellen. They have tea, but the butter wasn't enough, so she gave them the seed cake. So she was going to give them the seed cake in the end, but then she ended up giving them the seed cake at the present moment. Miss Temple gives Jane a chance to defend herself, but warned her not to exaggerate. So, basically, Miss Temple, who was a good person, she was good-natured and she was righteous. She gave Jane the chance to defend herself. Jane tells Miss Temple everything from the bottom of her heart. To confirm whether Jane's words are true, Miss Temple writes to Mr. Lloyd. He confirms Jane's word, and Miss Temple publicly announces Jane's innocence. Jane was very content with her life at Lowood. She excels in drawing and French. In the end of the chapter, Jane says that she would not exchange Lowood for Gateshead's luxuries. So basically, what happened in this chapter was that Jane was very sad that her reputation was ruined. But Ellen, being the optimistic person she is, so optimistic means positive, Ellen was positive. She told Jane that the girls did feel bad for Jane. They were empathetic with her. And that if Mr. Bucklehurst liked Jane and, complimented her, the girls would be jealous. But this is actually good because no one will take Jane as a threat. But in the end, Jane will get her reputation back after Miss Temple proves her innocence. Chapter 9. So now it's like summertime and the warm weather came. But with the warm weather, there's illnesses that come. Jane has a new friend named Mary Ann Wilson. Mary Ann Wilson, she had, good stories, fun stories. She was no Helen Burns, but she did have good stories. Jane finds out saddening news. Ellen was dying of consumption. Jane was determined to see Ellen, so she sneaked into Miss Temple's room. Ellen tells Jane not to grieve, that she is happy. She will be leaving all the pain and suffer on earth, and she will be going to God. Turns out Ellen has a father, but he abandoned her and told her that he won't miss her. So now we can kind of see why Ellen, she had that disappointment in herself. She felt like something was wrong with her because her father left her and he put her at Lowood. That night, Jane takes Ellen to her arms. They kiss and Helen dies in Jane's arms. Very saddening. Chapter 10. Jane has grown up and many aspects of her life have changed. Lowood is now run by another group of people because Mr. Bucklehurst was not a very good person. And again, something about Mr. Bucklehurst and the Victorian era. So in the Victorian era, many people who were actually really bad people disguised religion and the church as a way to make them look good. So basically, they were very corrupt people, but they used the church to make them look good. Since the treatment that the girls have been given caused the illnesses and deaths, so there was a reason behind it. It wasn't the warm weather, it was the treatments. The living conditions improved rapidly. The girls were provided with additional clothing, food, and all other necessities. Jane was in the first class and in the top percent. So as you can see, Jane was very hardworking and determined because she was achieving very good results at school. Sadly, Miss Temple got married and left. Jane felt as if she had lost her. Jane was longing for adventure, so she goes out of town in search of a post. She bumps into Bessie. Bessie was married to the coach and they had 2 children, a boy named Bobby and a girl named Jane. I did not write Jane, but later we find out that Bessie does call her daughter Jane. Then she tells her about the Reeds. When Mrs. Reed and Georgiana visited London, a lord fell in love with Georgiana, and they ran away together. But Eliza ratted them out, and that caused a huge friction between Eliza and Georgiana. So later we will see that Eliza and Georgiana do not get along. John went to college and began to waste money. Then Bessie reveals that Jane's uncle, so her paternal uncle, wanted to take her with him to an island, but Mrs. Reed told him that Jane was gone. Now we will be doing an analysis and we will be done with the video. So, we have Jane's character traits. Jane's adventurous because she did not want to stay at Lowood. She was tired of it. She was tired of teaching there for 2 years. She was tired of being there for so long, so she wanted something new. And then courageous. Jane had this courage to stand up to her auntie. Just at the age of 10, she stood up to her. Jane was determined because, she was really determined to find Ellen when Ellen was sick, and she didn't let anyone get her way. Friendly. Jane was really friendly because she developed 2 friends while at Lowood. She developed a friend with Ellen, and Ellen in the beginning, she was kind of, she kept to herself, but Jane really worked hard and she developed a friendship with Ellen. Hardworking. Jane is very hardworking. She was the first at her class and she worked hard whenever she had something. She never really did a mediocre job. She always did her best. Jane was rebellious. Despite being this hard-working, determined girl, Jane always had this little rebellion in her. Jane was very strong-willed. When Jane wanted something, she did it. When Jane really, wanted something to do, she did it. And then relationships. Bessie. She had a great relationship with Bessie. Bessie often sang to her. Bessie was kind of her only rock at Gateshead. Bessie was the only good thing that was there at Gateshead. Ellen Burns. Ellen Burns was her close friend. They learned a lot from each other and they were there for each other at Lowood. Miss Temple was great. Miss Temple was generous, she was good-natured, and she was always there for Jane. She was one of Jane's first motherly figures. Mary Ann Wilson was a good friend, they were friends. Mr. Bucklehurst was a very bad person to Jane, and he was corrupt. Mrs. Reed, they had a non-existent relationship. Bessie. Bessie was loving because she always nourished and loved Jane, and she was talented because she always had the talent for singing. The change that had happened to Bessie was that Bessie was now a wife. She was married and she was a mother of two, mother of Bobby and mother of Jane. Ellen Burns. So despite not being with Ellen Burns throughout many, chapters, we did gather a few character traits. So she's a daydreamer because she had said so. She's forgiving because she always forgives everyone who does bad to her. And she's very religious and she always has faith. So she always has this forgiving part about her. She's a very kind person. She's very sweet. She never hurt anyone and she was always there for Jane. She's knowledgeable. She always had knowledge. She always read books. She was positive. She always saw the good side in things. But when Jane was punished, she showed her the positive and the optimistic side. She was religious because she always believed in God and she had this deep faith. And she was very self-critical because she was always insecure and hated her flaws. Her relationships, so she had a very close relationship with Jane. Her father abandoned her, so his son existed. And Miss Catcher, they had a very bad relationship. Miss Temple was generous. She always had the kids, and whenever the girls didn't have enough food, she gave them more food, and she also gave Jane the Andy seed cakes. She was good-natured because she had Jane get her reputation back, and she never liked to see something wrong be done, so she was always just. And she was righteous, like I said, because she was always just, and she didn't let, you know, what Mr. Bucklehurst do to Jane pass away. She slip away. She got Jane's right back. And then Mrs. Reed. Mrs. Reed is cruel. She's mean. She's disappointed with her son, Miss John Reed, because he wasted money and he was not a good person. She was strong. She had this very strong personality. She was very bitter though. She was even mean to a 10-year-old who was an orphan. And she's very sexist because she treats John as if he's the master, but she treats Jane very badly. And Jane's gender does have to do with the way Mrs. Reed treated her. John Reed is a disappointment. He's very idiotic, like he doesn't think before he acts and just wastes money. So he's not taking advantage of the privilege he has. He's irresponsible. He's very violent. He was very violent towards Jane, and he was a bully who often referred to Jane as a rat. That's how he referred to her. Mr. Bucklehurst, he was evil, and he characterized religion as a way to be corrupt. He was a very selfish man. He was religious, and he was powerful. So he had this power at Lowood. Like even when they found out that the treatments were bad, he did not get punished. He was just removed, but he did not get punished. And that's it for this chapter, you guys. I really hope you liked this, and I really hope you understood more about the novel, and especially that you got more details, because the point of these summaries are to be detailed. So I hope you liked them, and thank you for watching.